Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the small island of Corsica, is one of the most famous men to have ever lived, hailed as the man of the 19th century. Even his very name is used as a word to describe something momentous, colossal, Napoleonic. A rags to riches story, Napoleon was only 24 years old when he became a general, and 35 when he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Charismatic leader of men, brilliant politician, and a military genius, Napoleon fought 60 battles in his career and only lost 7 of them, making him the most victorious general in history. Not since the days of ancient Rome and the Caesars had one man conquered so much of Europe, or held so much power. The so-called man of destiny and a mass of contradictions, Napoleon remains something of an enigma, at times a hopeless romantic idealist, and the bitterest of cynics. His iron will, sheer intellect, and of course his fiery temperament, captivated or alarmed. To some he was a god, to others the Antichrist. And his meteoric rise and then crushing downfall has been compared to a Greek tragedy. After less than 15 years in power, in the last of 7 wars formed against him by coalitions of European monarchs, Napoleon was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the remote rocky island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of his life, reflecting on his misfortunes, Napoleon's analysis was, "I have too much ambition and a spirit of fire." This is the story of Napoleon and the dawn of a new age. By the beginning of 1799, Napoleon had been in control of Egypt for over 6 months. He had, at first, hoped for a compromise with its ex-rulers, the Mamelukes, and had sent Ibrahim and Murad Bey offers that if they ceased to resist, they and their horsemen could retain ownership of all their property, with a decent salary paid by France, while the latter would be named governor of Upper Egypt. At first, they pondered this offer, but when they had heard of the crushing French naval defeat at the Battle of the Nile, they rejected his proposals, believing Napoleon was now doomed. The destruction of the French fleet deprived them of their ascendancy in the eastern Mediterranean and gave mastery of it to England. They placed Egypt in a state of blockade, and now redoubled their efforts against France, and were even making plans to gather a vast army in India to sail to the Red Sea and attack the French from behind. Napoleon had been keen to avoid a rupture with the Sultan of Turkey at Constantinople, who, in name only, possessed Egypt. The Mamelukes, who had rebelled against the Sultan's authority by ruling Egypt as their own, had soothed his wrath by paying him tribute. Napoleon proposed that the French would continue paying the tribute so that the riches of the Turkish Empire would not be diminished by the transfer of Egypt into French hands. The Sultan was not sorry to see the Mamelukes punished, but he looked suspiciously at a victorious European army so close to his throne and in the wealthiest province of his empire. Previously indecisive, the Sultan was emboldened by the news of the destruction of the French navy. More than one assassin was sent by the Turks to murder Napoleon, but some friendly Egyptian notables gave him timely notice and helped him evade the plots. Back in Paris, the French Foreign Minister, Talleyrand, had promised Napoleon that he would personally lead a diplomatic mission to Constantinople in an effort to negotiate a treaty with the Sultan. In letter after letter, Napoleon kept asking Talleyrand whether he had kept his promise, but he never received a reply. It was not part of his plan to forward Napoleon's career, or to put himself through the discomfort of a 1,000-mile journey. As a result, In autumn 1798, the event that Napoleon most feared took place. Under pressure from England, Turkey declared war on France, bent on reclaiming Egypt. By January 1799, two military menaces now threatened Egypt. Napoleon received reports that the Turkish army that had been amassing in Syria had been placed in the hands of the Mamelukes. This army's advance guard had just invaded the borders of Egypt and had captured El-Arish, occupying the provinces of Gaza and Jaffa. This force was also helped by the English and French émigrés who supported putting a Bourbon king back on the throne and who were landing supplies and providing skilled military engineers. One of the leaders of this force was the Pasha of Syria, Ahmed Jazar, also known as the Butcher, a nickname that summarized his legendary cruelty. He was loathed by the Syrians, who he had ruled for 25 years. Jazar specialized in maiming and mutilating people and devising horrific tortures, like having his victims' feet shod with horseshoes, walling up Christians alive, and stripping court officials naked before having them hacked to death. Jazar even killed a few of his own wives. But, oddly enough, his hobby was cutting up flower shapes out of paper and giving them to visitors as presents. Napoleon had originally sent an envoy to open negotiations with Jazar, who was both an enemy of the Mamelukes and a rebel against Turkish rule. Napoleon had hoped that as Ibrahim Bey had been forced out of Egypt into Gaza, he and Jazar could join forces to destroy him together. But Jazar refused to see Napoleon's envoy, who was fortunate, as Jazar sometimes beheaded unwelcome messengers. And instead, Jazar made his peace with Turkey and the Mamelukes. Just as dire, this Syrian threat might be combined with an amphibious landing of troops along Egypt's north coast. Russia had also been stirred up by England to declare war on France. This Anglo-Russo alliance had little common purpose, except a desire to turn back French conquests and prevent them from expanding into the Middle East. Russia sailed its fleet down from the Black Sea, planning to link up with the English fleet and transport the Turkish army of 20,000 men gathered at Rhodes to invade Egypt. According to French intelligence, the first menace, marching from Syria, was imminent, but the invasion by sea would take longer to prepare, buying the French more time. In total, Napoleon had to face over 50,000 enemies, with a French army of just 30,000 men. Napoleon had ample reason for alarm. The Turks were well known all over Europe for their cruelty. They beheaded and often tortured prisoners, and kept Greece cowed by regular massacres of whole villages, including women and children. If a Turkish army were to enter Egypt, it would not only be a catastrophe for the French, but also for the Egyptians. As was usually his strategy, Napoleon's plan was to preempt and defeat the land threat from Syria as quickly and as far away from Egypt as possible. To accomplish this, Napoleon would have to move quickly. He decided to cross the Syrian desert, take the enemy by surprise, and cut up their army before it could be reinforced by the other army gathered at Rhodes, and then rush back to deal with the attack from the sea. Napoleon took pains to convince his officers that this new expedition across difficult terrain was well conceived. The only general to openly oppose it was Lagrange, who argued it would be less tiring and more certain to simply await the enemy in Egypt. In the end, Napoleon convinced them that in war, it is always preferable to seize the initiative before the enemy and surprise him before he was completely ready. This would also gain the French more maneuver space, and as a third advantage, It would be the enemy's land that suffered the inevitable collateral damage of war, not Egypt. This would always be a key principle to Napoleon's art of war. Napoleon wrote a long letter to the Directory, saying that he hoped to also finally force the English to make peace by denying their navy use of the Levantine ports like Acre, Haifa and Jaffa. Then raised the Lebanese and Syrian Christians who were awaiting his arrival before they revolted against the Turks, and he would decide later whether to march on Constantinople or all the way to India. One sentence of Napoleon's letter to the Directory was in code: "If, in the course of March, France is at war with the kings, I will return to France." Unbeknownst to Napoleon, who was unable to get any news from Europe because of the English blockade, it would be in that very month that England succeeded in forming a new coalition against France, even stronger than the first one. On the 12th of March, the War of the Second Coalition would begin, with France pitted against the monarchs of Russia, Turkey, Austria, Portugal and Naples, as well as the Pope. Their aim was to drive the French out of Italy and Germany and to invade France itself. As a result, the Directory would not be able to spare or send any aid at all to Napoleon. For this campaign into Syria, Napoleon could take an army of just 13,000 men, a third of his entire force in Egypt, all that he could spare, with the rest having to stay behind to hold down Egypt. As a sign of his trust, Napoleon had incorporated some Egyptian volunteers into his army, and had also created a corps of an entirely new kind, called the Dromedary Regiment, to give chase to the fierce bands of Arab robbers. 2 men, seated back to back, rode each camel, which could travel 90 miles without food, water or rest. Napoleon's formation of camel corps, fast-firing drill by alternating ranks, and pew, hooked stakes for quickly putting up palisades, were to be retained by French colonial armies up to World War I. The first French units left Cairo on January the 24th, 1799, singing the stirring revolutionary song, the Chant du Départ, which afterwards became a Bonapartist anthem. To try to draw Napoleon's attention away from Syria, the English fleet began to bombard Alexandria. But Napoleon knew this attack was just a diversion. Napoleon himself left Cairo a few weeks later, and despite her pleading, he refused to let his mistress Pauline join him. The campaign was far too dangerous, especially when taking on such vicious enemies. So Pauline stayed in Cairo, where Napoleon wrote her passionate love letters. However, none can be quoted, as Pauline burnt them all before her death. Napoleon began the march over the unmapped Sinai Desert, 150 miles wide, which separates Africa from Asia. He would have to overcome problems of food supply, water, heat, and again, hostile Bedouin tribesmen. Napoleon dismounted his camel from the outset, wading through the burning hot sands with his men and sharing their deprivations. Napoleon wrote to Desaix that, "We have crossed over 150 miles of desert, which is exceedingly fatiguing. We had brackish water, and often none at all. We ate dogs, donkeys, and camels." 5 harrowing days were spent crossing this wilderness. Once, when Napoleon was passing by, a soldier who was nearly suffocated by the heat offered to give up his place under the cool shadow of a pillar to his commander, and this, Napoleon recalled, was no trifling concession. Another time, a group of troops got tragically lost among the sand dunes. Napoleon took some Arabs and camels and went to search for them. The missing men were found half dead from thirst. Some of the younger soldiers had broken their muskets in a frenzy and thrown them away. But they rejoiced at the sight of their commander, especially when Napoleon told them that food and water were close by. But if relief had been longer delayed, would that have excused your murmurings and loss of courage? No. Soldiers learned to die with honour. The western coastal route that Napoleon marched was the same that Alexander the Great had taken, but in the opposite direction. Of course, Napoleon appreciated the historical aspects of this campaign. I constantly read Genesis when visiting the places it describes. I was amazed beyond measure that they were still exactly as Moses had described them. The French army first arrived in front of El-Arish, a small, strongly fortified town plagued by poverty. It was within the boundaries of Egypt and had been recently captured by the Turks and their Arab allies, who were 2,000 strong. The French were repulsed in their attacks on the town twice, a delay which robbed them of over a week of precious time and 400 French casualties, which Napoleon could not afford. There were already violent murmurs among the soldiers, who were exhausted and thirsty, and started insulting the scholars, once again unfairly blaming them for this entire expedition. A few days later, the Turks were woken up by their walls being bombarded, which created breaches large enough to send in French troops. The Turks sprang to their guns, and after a short but bloody skirmish, Napoleon demanded the surrender of the fort, including its few thousand men, which was agreed by the Turkish co-commandant. Now, all these men were effectively his prisoners. Napoleon was unsure what to do with them. He only had 13,000 soldiers to face the power of the Turkish Empire and all its Middle Eastern allies, as well as the fleets and aid sent by England and Russia. Napoleon's main problem was providing his soldiers with food. Hunger was becoming rampant in his own camp, and it was difficult to get his hands on daily rations for his troops. Napoleon could not keep these Turkish prisoners with him, as they would eat the bread he needed for his own army. They would also need a strong guard to keep them from rising up, and the French were already so outnumbered that none of them could be spared from active service, nor to escort the prisoners across the desert back to Egypt. But to disarm these prisoners and free them on their word of honor to no longer fight against the French seemed equally risky. They might join the nearest Turkish camp and swell the enemy's already huge numbers. And even if that did not secure Napoleon's defeat, it would cost him the lives of many of his own soldiers. But to kill these prisoners in cold blood seemed revolting. In the end, Napoleon decided to take the risk and freed the prisoners on condition that they took an oath to take no further part in the war. The Turkish commanders and their senior officers all swore on the Koran that neither they nor their troops would take up arms against the French again, and that they would not return to Syria for a year from that day. To encourage them to keep their word, Napoleon sent a division of the army to escort these prisoners, who were disarmed, 1 day's march away towards Baghdad, where they promised to go. But no sooner had the French escort left them than the newly freed prisoners also turned back, breaking their promise by making a beeline for the fortress of Jaffa, where they joined the army of Khazar, who once again armed them and placed them in his front ranks. Napoleon continued the march through the dry, barren, and baking hot land. But the countryside gradually began to change as they entered the fertile plains near Gaza, with groves of olive and lemon trees and wood-covered hills. Napoleon wrote to Dizay, "It is exactly like the countryside of Languedoc. It is like being near Béziers." As the French approached the mountains of Syria, clouds began to form and a few drops of rain fell, a phenomenon the army had not seen for many months. The soldiers rejoiced, throwing back their heads to catch the precious water. In one skirmish, General Lannes, in spite of his orders from Napoleon, stubbornly pursued a troop of mountaineers into the passes of Nablus, where he and his men were ambushed. Afterwards, Napoleon reprimanded Lannes for his foolishness, and for having sacrificed without any object a number of brave men. Lannes tried to justify himself, saying the mountaineers had defied him, and he wished to punish them. "We are not in a condition to play the swaggerer," Napoleon retorted. After a few days of marching, the French halted at Gaza, where they came across another division of the Turkish army on the 24th of February. Though led by the ferocious Shazar himself, the Turks were chased out of the city by the French within an hour, who seized large amounts of ammunition, 6 cannon, and 200,000 vital rations of biscuits. On the 3rd of March, 23 days after leaving Cairo, Napoleon arrived at Jaffa, where matters took a much more serious turn. Strongly garrisoned, it contained 8,000 people and was surrounded by a massive wall and towers. But Napoleon had no heavy battering train to besiege the town, as such clumsy equipment could not be dragged across the desert. Napoleon had ordered some artillery to follow them in small ships along the coast, but they had already been intercepted and captured by the English ships. However, the French did not have a moment to lose. Their enemies were converging towards them from every side. The English navy was landing men, supplies, artillery, and European engineers to try to stop the French, making the capture of one of their key ports, like Jaffa, vital. The Allied fleets of Turkey and Russia were also hovering along the coast to prevent any supplies from being sent to Napoleon from Egypt. 30,000 Turks, with infantry and horsemen, were stationed at nearby Damascus. 20,000 more Turks were waiting to set sail at Rhodes. Napoleon's only hope was to quickly and decisively defeat the separate parts of his enemies before they could all unite. Napoleon laid siege to Jaffa from noon on the 3rd of March. A dangerous afternoon for him. D'Augereau recalled, "Bonaparte approached, with a few others, to within 100 yards. As we turned back, we were spotted. One of the cannonballs fired at us by the enemy fell very close to the commander, who was showered with earth." A few days later, on the 6th of March, the defenders of Jaffa made a sortie, and the French were hurled back. At dawn the next day, Napoleon wrote a polite letter to Jaffa's governor, calling on him to surrender, and writing that his heart is moved by the evil that will fall upon the whole city if it subjects itself to this assault. Napoleon also sent messengers to the Turkish military commandant, offering to spare the lives of the garrison in exchange for its immediate surrender. "To avoid great misfortune falling on the city, I ask you to surrender peacefully. God is good and generous, and we respect his commandments. If you refuse my offer, you will be annihilated." And so it was made clear that in this desperate campaign, the French would be showing no mercy. Neither, as it turned out, would the Turks. Napoleon's aide-de-camp carried this letter calling for their surrender to the Turkish compound, escorted by 4 French soldiers. The Turks' response to Napoleon's offer was to ostentatiously display the 5 severed heads of these unfortunate messengers on spikes along the ramparts as a gory trophy, and on closer inspection it was seen that before being decapitated, the men had been subjected to torture. Their genitals had been stuffed in their mouths. The French troops witnessed this provocative spectacle from the trenches and the bodies being thrown from the walls, and they boiled with rage. They vividly remembered the massacre of their comrades in the Cairo revolt, and the fate of the many stragglers and lost soldiers murdered in the desert after torture and mutilations. And this seemed to be their last straw. Napoleon gave the order for the artillery to breach the walls of Jaffa and for the city to be stormed. And by 5 p.m, the enraged French soldiers had flooded inside and were wreaking bloody vengeance. Having up until now showed exemplary discipline, the soldiers completely lost control and went on the rampage. One French scholar wrote, "The sights were terrible, the sound of shots, shrieks of women and fathers, piles of bodies, a daughter being raped on the cadaver of her mother, the smell of blood, the groans of the wounded, the shouts of the victors quarrelling about loot." Napoleon immediately sent orders for his officers to stop the killing spree. They tried to restrain the frenzied troops, but it proved almost impossible to stop their violence. Among others, General Robin did not hesitate, at the risk of his own life, to take the sabre to his own men to try to stop the atrocities. Reporting to the Directory, Napoleon admitted that 24 hours was handed over to pillage and to all the horrors of war, which never appeared to me so hideous. At this time in history, however, cities that refused to surrender when given the chance were considered to deserve sacking. A decade later, in 1812, the British were to subject Badajoz in Spain to 3 days of looting and mass rape so severe that the Duke of Wellington only finally regained control of his men by building a gallows in the main square, which he did not have to actually use. At Jaffa, 60 Frenchmen were killed and 150 wounded. The numbers of enemy soldiers and civilians are unknown. During the sacking, Napoleon sent 2 of his aides, Crozier and his stepson Eugène, with an escort to try to calm the soldiers down and stop their crimes. Taking up this message, they went to Jaffa's citadel, where several thousand of the Turkish garrison had taken refuge and barricaded themselves. The maddened French soldiers were shooting at these Turks as they appeared at the windows, battering the doors with cannonballs and trying to set fire to it. 1,000 or so of these Turks were the same men who had surrendered to the French at El-Arish and who had violated their oath to no longer fight. They now once again asked the 2 aides whether they could surrender if their lives were again spared. Listening only to their better nature, the aides accepted their surrender, managed to save them from the enraged soldiers, and then led all 2,000 to 3,000 of them as prisoners to the French camp. Napoleon was walking in front of his tent when he saw the swarm of Turks approaching. The appalling dilemma now facing him was immediately obvious. Napoleon's face fell, and he exclaimed, "What do you wish me to do with these men? Have I food for them? Ships to transport them to Egypt or France? What the devil can I do with them all? Why have they served me thus?" Eugène and Crozier defended themselves for taking them prisoner, saying he had ordered them to go and stop the carnage. Yes, as to women, children, and old men, all the peaceful inhabitants, but not with respect to armed soldiers. It was your duty to die rather than bring these unfortunate creatures to me. What do you want me to do with them? The prisoners were then ordered to sit down and placed in front of the tents, their hands tied behind their backs, and Napoleon had them given a little biscuit and bread, squeezed out of the already scanty rations for his army. Now, Napoleon was placed in a crisis of conscience. On a practical level, the prisoners were unmanageable. Napoleon could keep them captive, but then the severe food shortage made it impossible to feed them. 300 miles from their base in Cairo, his own men had barely enough dry biscuit for themselves, and in desert country, struggled to find more food. Or Napoleon could free the prisoners, 1,000 of who were the same men he had already released on parole at El-Arish, and who had broken their pledge not to fight again. Before the second half of the 20th century, and especially in the Middle East, the rules of war were simple, harsh, and essentially unchanging. As a soldier, to give one's word and then break it was generally recognized as a capital offense, tantamount to a death sentence. Clearly, if released, these prisoners would once again rejoin the Turkish army, swelling the numbers of a force which already far outnumbered the French. Having accepted their word once, Napoleon could not have been expected to do so again, and if he did, his Eastern opponents would surely take it as a sign of his own weakness. which would encourage them to resist to the death. Future operations would be compromised. Yet, to simply abandon these prisoners in the open desert would condemn them to a slow and painful death by thirst or starvation, while any survivors would rejoin the enemy ranks and perhaps cause the total destruction of the French army. Either these Turks would have to starve, or he would have to fight them again, and in doing so, shed French blood. For their part, the Turks notoriously spared no prisoners. All who fell into their hands perished, often after being tortured. Napoleon found the decision too appalling to make alone, and he did what he had never done before in Egypt. He called a council of war, made up of his generals and senior officers, which was immediately held in his tent to decide their fate. They deliberated for hours, with each giving his own opinion, and it was adjourned without coming to any conclusion. The council was reconvened the next day and deliberated for many more hours, trying to come up with any measures or ideas to spare the prisoners' lives. Still, the third day arrived, without the council being able to come to any conclusion. The French soldiers had begun to murmur, complaining at the idea of having their own scanty rations given to the prisoners, and of having men who had already broken their promises and killed their comrades once again freed. Napoleon looked to the ocean in the hope that some French ship might appear to relieve him of his burden, which was, according to Bourrienne, one of the reasons why he risked his army's discontent for 3 whole days. But no ship appeared. By the delays, the trouble in the army was already seriously magnified. General Bonne pointed out that the discontent was so deep and general that unless something was done quickly, a serious revolt in the army was possible. In the higher interests of the mission, the council finally and unanimously decided that the prisoners must be put to death. It seemed to them a lesser evil than any of the other possibilities. Napoleon signed the fateful order, a death sentence, but one that would have been without moral dilemma if it had taken place in the heat of battle. Still, Napoleon made some exceptions. He allowed 500 of the prisoners, who were of Egyptian origin, to freely return there. In his own account, Berthier stated his belief that these men had forfeited their lives when Jaffa refused to surrender, regardless of the promise they had broken at El-Arish, and he did not differentiate between the deaths taken in battle or cold blood. Bourrienne recorded in his memoirs, "I assisted at all the councils and deliberations, though of course without possessing any deliberative voice, but I must in all honesty declare that, had I possessed a right of voting, my voice would have been for death. The result of the deliberations and the circumstances of the army would have constrained me to this. For my own part, I have a perfect conviction that he could not do otherwise than yield to the dire necessity of the case. It was the advice of the council, whose opinion was unanimous in favour of the execution, that governed him. Indeed, I owe it also to truth to state that Napoleon yielded only at the last extremity, and was one of those, perhaps, who beheld the massacre with the deepest pain." On the 10th of March, the Turkish prisoners were led in silence to the sand dunes by the coast, where they were divided into small squares. Pérouse, a senior quartermaster, described in a letter to his mother what happened next. 2 battalions started to shoot them. They had no other recourse to save themselves but to throw themselves into the sea. They could shoot them there, and in a moment the sea was dyed with blood and covered with corpses. A few had the chance to save themselves on rocks. They sent soldiers in boats to finish them off. We left a detachment on the seashore, and our perfidy attracted a few of them, who were mercilessly massacred. We were recommended not to use powder, and we had the ferocity to kill them with bayonets. This example will teach our enemies not to trust the French, and sooner or later The blood of these 3,000 victims will revisit us. Pérouse was right. Less than 2 years later, in 1801, when Egypt fell to the British, and when El Aft on the banks of the Nile was abandoned by the French, the Turks beheaded every Frenchman unable to flee. When the British protested, the Turks answered with angry cries of "Jaffa! Jaffa!" The massacre at Jaffa is one of the darkest stains on Napoleon's character. Decades later, he himself defended his reasons. If I had spared them again and sent them away on their parole, they would directly have gone to Acre and have played over for the second time the same scene that they had done at Jaffa. In justice to the lives of my soldiers, as every general ought to consider himself as their father and them as his children, I could not allow this. To leave as a guard a portion of my army, already reduced in number due to the breach of faith of those wretches, was impossible. Indeed, to have acted otherwise than as I did would probably have caused the destruction of my whole army. I therefore, availing myself of the rights of war, which authorized the putting to death of prisoners taken under such circumstances, independent of the right given to me by having taken the city by assault, and that of retaliation on the Turks, ordered that the prisoners, who in defiance of their surrender had been found bearing weapons against me, should be selected out and shot. The rest, amounting to a considerable number, were spared. I would do the same thing again tomorrow, and so would Wellington, or any general commanding an army under similar circumstances. In Napoleon's opinion, it was the only possible decision he could have made. I had a right. There were not enough provisions for French and Turks. One must go to the wall. In war, as in politics, no evil, even if it is permissible under the rules, is excusable unless it is absolutely necessary. Everything beyond that is a crime. In a war against the merciless Khazar, who that year alone had had 400 Christians sewn into sacks and thrown into the sea, Napoleon may have also felt the need to be seen as equally ruthless. On the 9th of March, just before the massacres, Napoleon wrote to Khazar, saying that he had been harsh towards those who had broken the rules of war, adding, "In a few days I shall march upon Acre, but why should I shorten the life of an old man I do not know?" Luckily for that French messenger, Khazar chose to ignore Napoleon's threat. The Turkish commander at Jaffa, Abdallah, was luckier than his soldiers. He had hid during the sacking of the city, and disguised as a monk, snuck into the French camp, found Napoleon's tent, and fell on his knees before him. Abdallah was treated well, provided the French with up-to-date intelligence of the Turks' movements, and was sent to Cairo. The same day, Napoleon also made a proclamation to the sheikhs, ulema, and the commandant of Jerusalem, telling them of the terrible punishments awaiting his enemies, but further declaring, "God is clement and merciful. It is not my intention to wage war against the people. I am a friend of the Muslim." Jaffa did not bring luck to the army. The plague, the most feared scourge of the East, now broke out in the French army. Spread by a rat-borne flea, the disease caused swellings first in the armpits and the groin, then in the throat, from which death usually followed in a few days. Resistant to treatment, and with a 92% chance of death for sufferers, the appearance of its buboes on the body was practically a death sentence. Captain Francois noted in his journal that after the sack of Jaffa, soldiers who caught the plague were right away covered with buboes in the groin, in the armpits, and on the neck. In less than 24 hours, the body became black as well as the teeth, and a burning fever killed anyone who was affected by this terrible disease. Some have been tempted to see the plague as a manifestation of poetic justice for the massacre at Jaffa, but in fact, the first case of the plague had appeared in Alexandria before they had left Egypt, and Napoleon had hoped that the illness would not follow them. Of all the various strands of plague infecting the Middle East at the time, this, La Peste, was one of the worst. Khazar and the English could not have wished for a better ally. The epidemic created a panic, and the morale of the French army plummeted, despite the care and competence of the chief physician, Desgenais, and his staff, who first tried to hide the true name of the disease from the army, but to no avail. Soldiers refused to go near their sick comrades, and even many physicians, terrified of the contagion, abandoned the sufferers to die without care. Back in Alexandria, Napoleon had invented another of his unusual punishments to root out this behavior. Surgeon Boyer, who had refused to attend to plague victims, had been forced to walk the streets dressed as a woman, wearing a placard stating, "Unworthy to be a French citizen, he fears death." A great psychological shock was needed to get things moving again, to show that exposure to plague victims was not fatal. On the 11th of March, Napoleon entered the Armenian monastery hospital on the seafront in Jaffa, which he had turned into a quarantine station. In one small and overcrowded ward, according to Jean-Pierre Dor, an officer in the commissariat, Napoleon picked up and carried a plague victim who was lying across the doorway, scorning the risk of infection and under the horrified gaze of his officers. This action scared us a lot, because the sick man's clothes were covered with foam and disgusting evacuations of abscessed buboes. It was a grand gesture, but one that Napoleon did at the risk of his own life. Setting an example, Napoleon went around the entire hospital, speaking with all the sick who were still conscious, and plied them with encouragement. He even touched the patients, saying, "See, it's nothing." One grenadier, who was so plague-stricken he could hardly move a limb, replied to Napoleon, "You are right. Your grenadiers were not made to die in a hospital." After nearly 2 hours, when Napoleon was about to leave, one of the physicians reproached him for so recklessly exposing himself to danger. Napoleon coolly replied, "It is only my duty. I am the commander-in-chief." Due to his strong belief in providence and destiny, the idea of dying by the plague probably never even crossed Napoleon's mind. He believed that the plague was susceptible to willpower, recalling years later, those who kept up their spirits and did not give way to the idea that they must die generally recovered, but those who desponded almost invariably fell a sacrifice to the disorder. When Bourrienne told Napoleon that one of the generals at Jaffa refused to shake his hand for fear of becoming infected, Napoleon remarked, "If he is afraid of the plague, he will die of it." And the general did so not long after. Circulating through the French army, the news of their commander's bravery produced the desired effect. Courage proved more contagious than the plague. A minor miracle followed, as soldiers no longer refused to go near or help their suffering comrades, and the physicians returned to their duty. Confidence was restored to the army, which was able to set off again. Napoleon now prepared to march on Acre, the most important military post in Syria and a holy place. The French advance guard reached it on the 19th of March, finding it strongly garrisoned and well supplied, and commanded by Khazar himself. A port protected by the sea on 3 sides, Acre was the most formidable defense system in the Middle East. A fortress built by the Crusaders, the passing centuries had left its defences weakened, but its huge 8 feet thick walls were still there, though not as high, and it was defended by a deep moat, ramparts, and 250 guns. Acre was the only fortress in Syria which could stop Napoleon, and if captured, would make him the undisputed master of Syria. Napoleon would be able to deny the English fleet their most important base, and he himself would have a clear route to Damascus and Constantinople. The stakes were high, but so were the odds against him. Inside the port was a strong Turkish garrison of 4,000 Afghans, Albanians and Moors, and 800 English soldiers. Jazar's efficient Jewish chief of staff, Haim Fari, who had lost a nose, ear and eye to his master over the years, advised him on tactics, as did the English Commodore, Sir Sidney Smith. Napoleon already knew of Sidney Smith, who he had helped defeat and driven out of Toulon in 1793. Sir Sidney had been captured by the French soon after, but had escaped with the help of a certain Philippot, a royalist military engineer, and Napoleon's old rival classmate from his school days at the École Militaire. Colonel Philippot now skillfully organised Acre's defence and commanded Jazar's artillery against his fellow Frenchmen. Jazar had sent news to Sidney Smith, then in Constantinople, of the French approach, and he had sailed into Acre's harbour just in the nick of time, 2 days before the French arrived, strengthening Jazar with 2 ships of the line to join the Turkish gunboats, along with engineers, artillerymen, and crucially, had the ability to constantly resupply Jazar. Most unfortunately for Napoleon, he now faced yet another naval disappointment. He was forced to watch in horror from the cliffs above Haifa, as his flotilla of 9 ships, carrying all his siege equipment and heavy artillery, 44 guns in all, rounded the headlands of Carmel straight into the hands of Sidney Smith's fleet. 6 French ships were captured, and only 3 escaped to Toulon. Most of Napoleon's heaviest weaponry was then mounted on the ramparts of Acre and turned against him. This was an irreparable loss to Napoleon, who now only had 12 cannon, and was a massive blow to his hopes for a quick siege. Napoleon then sent an officer with a letter to Jazar, offering peace. "What signify a few leagues more, added to the countries I have conquered? Since God has given victory into my hands, I will, like him, be forgiving and merciful, not only toward the people, but towards their rulers also." But in a sign that the course of events were turning, Jazar reverted to form and beheaded the French messengers sent with the peace terms, and then massacred several hundred Christians in the city, without any protest from Sidney Smith or Philippot. The French troops were again horrified when the butcher displayed the heads of their comrades on the ramparts. A few days later, they found bags strewn on the beach. They revealed the headless bodies of the French messengers tied in pairs. Though their resources were depleted, Napoleon had no choice but to carry on. Dogereau recorded, "At first, the place looked indefensible and unlikely to hold out for 8 days. It was thought that we only had to present ourselves before Acre, when the memory of the fate of Jaffa, which we had taken so easily, would terrify the Pasha." But, with the benefit of hindsight, Dogereau concluded that Napoleon should have returned to Egypt at this point, as Jazar was in no position to threaten Egypt anymore after the loss of El-Arish, Gaza, Jaffa, and soon enough, Haifa, which Napoleon could have garrisoned before leaving. However, Napoleon had not yet defeated the Turkish army of 25,000 men that had been amassing at Damascus, which had been the primary purpose of the invasion. And the French began their siege works at noon on the 19th of March, surrounding the city with fortifications and digging trenches to help shield them from enemy fire. Despite his lack of siege artillery, especially the large 24-pounders that would allow him to break the walls, Napoleon hoped that the light artillery he had, and sheer French esprit once the breach was made, might still capture the city. On the 28th of March, Napoleon began a series of costly assaults, following in the footsteps of the Crusaders, who captured this fortress after no less than 3 arduous years of siege. Although Napoleon's headquarters were over 1,000 yards from Acre, on the same hillside where, coincidentally, Richard the Lionheart had led his siege of the place. Some of Napoleon's siege lines had to go through a mosquito-infested swamp, which soon caused a malaria outbreak. Over the next 9 weeks, Napoleon launched no fewer than 9 major and 3 minor attacks on Acre. At one point during the siege, Napoleon ran so low on ammunition that he had to pay soldiers to pick up cannonballs fired by the enemy to shoot back at them. They received between half a franc and a franc each, depending on the caliber. The French were not the only ones being offered incentives. One of the explanations for the large number of Turkish sorties, 26, was that Jazar was paying a high reward for every French head he was brought. After a few days of bombardment and undermining, the French were actually on the point of taking the city. An assault group, commanded by Chateau Renaud, the brother of one of the 5 messengers who had been tortured and beheaded at Jaffa, managed to reach the keep and seize the Turkish pavilion itself. The Turks abandoned their positions, and Jazar himself fled to a Turkish ship in the harbour, taking his treasures with him. But the troops assigned to support Chateau Renaud were hindered by the moat, which was much deeper than they expected. They tried and failed to use the ladders to scale the walls, and those who fell into the deep ditch were unable to climb back out and were shot. Almost all the French attackers perished, and the trapped Chateau Renaud fought to the death with his detachment. Jazar returned to his palace. 2 days later, Jazar attempted to attack an outlying castle, took several French prisoners, and had them ostentatiously strangled. Several other unsuccessful French attacks followed in the coming days. 3 times the French succeeded in breaching the castle walls and charged into the forecourt. And each time they were driven back in a bloodbath of slashing scimitars. Part of a tower fell down during one bombardment, but the later attack failed because the ladders were too short, which, understandably, demoralized the French. One Turkish sortie was repelled only after several hours of fighting. French engineers started to dig under a different tower and planted a mine to blow it up, but they were foiled by countermining. The siege entered a stalemate as Napoleon waited for more heavy guns to arrive from Egypt before he risked another attempt. Meanwhile, Napoleon issued a proclamation to the people of Syria in a bid to win them over. "I have come to Syria to drive out the Mamelukes and the army of the Pasha. What right had Acme to send his troops to attack me in Egypt? He has provoked me to war. I have brought it to him. But it is not on you, inhabitants, that I intend to inflict its horrors. Remain quiet in your homes. Let those who abandon them through fear return again. I will grant to everyone the property which he possesses. It is my wish that the cadis continue their functions as usual and dispense justice, that religion in particular be protected and revered, and that the mosques should continue to be frequented by all faithful Muslims. It is from God that all good things come. It is He who gives victory. The example of what has occurred at Gaza and Jaffa ought to teach you that, if I am terrible to my enemies, I am kind to my friends, and above all, benevolent and merciful to the poor." Napoleon had already formed an alliance with the Druzes and other Christian tribes who had taken refuge from the Turks in the mountains of Lebanon, and they only awaited the capture of Acre to join him en masse. They offered for sale to the French much-needed supplies, water and liquor. "With each passing day our camp resembles a country fair more and more," recorded Pérouse. "Wine, spirits, figs, wheat cakes, grapes, oil, and so on. Everything is in abundance here, albeit at sky-high price, but during the campaign pennies aren't counted." Delegations of leading men from Jerusalem and Nazareth often appeared to seek meetings with Napoleon and pledge their support, complaining of Jazar's cruelty and abuses. All the Syrians hate Jazar. There is no torture which he has not inflicted on the Christians, as well as on the Muslims of Syria, and even on his most faithful followers. He has cut the ears or nose off some, blinded and maimed others. Neither had the Turks been idle. They had stirred up a large part of the Muslim population, including tens of thousands of men from Damascus, as well as the Mameluke and Bedouin horsemen, to march in the name of the Prophet for the destruction of the Christian dogs. Napoleon had been harried for 10 days in besieging Acre, when he was told of the alarming approach of an enormous army of over 30,000 troops from Damascus, led by its Pasha, on its way to relieve Acre. Napoleon had been reduced to 8,000 effective men to face both the well-trained army of Europeans and Turks behind the walls of Acre and this huge mass rushing to its rescue. This army was on the move south towards the Jordan River, intending to encircle the French and trap them against the sea. Napoleon was outnumbered 3 times over. Despite these insane odds, instead of retreating, Napoleon decided he must foil their relief attempts by attacking the Damascus army as far away from Acre as possible. Luckily for him, this army, made up of Turks, Arabs and Mamelukes, were separate and came one by one, rather than in a coordinated attack. Able to spare just 4,000 men to ward them off, Junot then captured Nazareth, despite being outnumbered 10 to 1, and defeated in a sabre fight Murad Bey's own son. Napoleon sent Murat to capture Safed, where he seized enough provisions to last the army half a year. These 2 victories stopped the advance of the Damascus army, momentarily. General Kleber then heard that the main enemy force had swung around to the south, and he came up with an audacious maneuver to circle behind them and cut off their retreat back to Damascus. Kleber decided to surreptitiously withdraw by a night march, and then surprise the Turkish army with a dawn attack at the springs where they were watering their horses and camels, which was a long process. Just a few hours before his attack, General Kleber sent a message to tell Napoleon of his plan, who immediately gathered all the forces he could lay his hands on, around 6,000 men, some cavalry and artillery. Napoleon raced to Kleber's aid towards Mount Tabor, 24 miles away, marching all night without stopping. Napoleon hoped to return to Acre before Jazar realized that only 2,000 men had been left behind to cover the siege. Napoleon also sent Murat with a strong detachment against the enemy rear, planning to sneak up on them. But Kleber's surprise attack did not go according to plan. During their night march, his guides went astray, so that by the time Kleber arrived at the enemy's camp, at 6 a.m. on the 16th of April, it was already full daylight. Failing to achieve surprise, on the exposed plain, Kleber's 2,000 men were immediately discovered in full view of the Turks, who also happened to be a much larger force than Kleber had thought. In fact, it was the entire 30,000-strong Damascus army. The Turks attacked across the plain, but Kleber had plenty of time to form his troops into 2 large squares, which, despite being encircled, stayed in formation. Late that same morning, Napoleon arrived on the heights which overlooked the battlefield, which was shrouded with thick smoke, and he could only make out the French by their regular volleys of musketry. At that moment, the situation had become critical for Kleber and his exhausted troops. By that time, under the scorching sun, Kleber had already been keeping the Turks at bay for 6 hours, who outnumbered him 10 to 1. Ammunition was running out, while Kleber successfully carried out the risky and difficult maneuver of merging his 2 squares into one. And he was on the point of throwing his remaining forces at the Turks, in a desperate attempt to break free and flee to the mountains. We were so exhausted from thirst and fatigue that we couldn't even speak, but we kept fighting, and gladly would have given all the bread we had for a few bullets and gunpowder, recalled Private Millet. But then some of Klebe's men noticed glints like the shine of bayonets to the north. It was a close call, a matter of minutes, when Napoleon appeared and quickly formed his 6,000 men into two squares. He planned to move forward in a way to form up with Klebe and create a triangle, enclosing the 30,000 Turks. Ignoring the most basic rules of warfare, Pasha Abdullah of Damascus had failed to post scouts to look out for any French reinforcements. At noon, Napoleon's two French squares rounded Mount Tabor and stealthily marched through wheat fields directly behind the Turks, and as they were hidden by a ridge, were not spotted until they were just ready to plunge onto the plain. They took the Turks completely by surprise from behind. A dream combination for any general, and one that Napoleon fully exploited. The sound of French cannon from the hills meant for Klebe's troops that hope changed camps and combat changed spirits. Shouts of "It's Bonaparte! It is Bonaparte!" burst from the ranks, and they raised their hats on the tips of their bayonets. No longer dealing with the French acting on the defensive, the Turks were attacked from the 3 points of the triangle. Murat, who Napoleon described as probably the bravest man in the world on the battlefield, led the cavalry, and with his towering height and ostentatious uniform, plunged into the fray, his white-plumed hat acting as a banner over the chaos. Murat recalled, "In the hottest of this terrible fight, I thought of Christ and of his transfiguration upon this very spot 2,000 years ago, and the reflection inspired me with courage and strength." And discouraged by this triple attack, the Turks broke ranks and fled. But they ran directly into another French square and were attacked from both sides. Caught between Napoleon's two squares and Klebe's forces, the Turks collapsed and tried to save themselves by a frantic flight towards Nablus and the Jordan River, which, unluckily for them, was flooded. Several thousand drowned, and their supplies, cannon, colours, 400 camels, and immense loot all fell into French hands, who themselves only suffered 400 casualties. One French soldier was dying of a terrible wound, but still found the energy to crawl over to a mangled Mameluke, even weaker than himself, and began to strangle him. One French officer shouted over to him, "How can you in your condition be guilty of such an act?" The soldier replied, "You speak much at your ease, you who are unhurt, but I who am dying must reap some enjoyment while I can." The French vigorously pursued them for the rest of the day and the next day. The victory was complete. With merely 8,000 men, the French had defeated 30,000 Turks and their allies. The Turkish army, who had boasted that they were as innumerable as the sands of the sea or as the stars of heaven, was not merely conquered, it was destroyed. As a result, control of Palestine had been secured, and its capital of Damascus now lay stripped of its defences and was only a few hours' march away. Napoleon was tempted to send Klebe to raise the tricolour flag over the tomb of Saladin, but he sensibly did not do so because of lack of forces. But Napoleon did want to explore the local area, full of history and spirituality, and after the battle, he slept at the convent near Nazareth, where he attended Mass, and was shown to the supposed bedchamber of the Virgin Mary, when the prior pointed out a broken black marble pillar and told Napoleon and his officers, in the gravest manner possible, that it had been split by the angel Gabriel when he came to announce to the Virgin her glorious and holy destination. Some of his officers burst out laughing, but as one of them recorded, General Bonaparte, looking severely at us, made us resume our gravity. Napoleon also revisited the battlefield and Mount Tabor itself the next day, where Nebuchadnezzar had climbed and Christ had been transfigured. While in Palestine, 150 years before the eventual foundation of the State of Israel, Napoleon also wrote a manifesto that promised the Jews their return to their spiritual homeland. During his Italian campaign, Napoleon had seen firsthand the distress of the Jews in Europe. Treated as pariahs since time immemorial, they had lived in a degrading regime of segregation, confined in ghettos, wearing distinctive insignia, and forbidden from serving in the government, among other professions. A French revolutionary decree of 1791 had granted the Jews full citizenship, but implementing this law had been half-hearted, though it had at least allowed Jews to serve in the French army. The operation in Palestine gave Napoleon the idea to restore the ancient sovereignty of the Jews over the holy places which they spiritually shared with the Christians and Muslims. On the 20th of April 1799, partly out of sympathy and partly to win them over, Napoleon wrote a bold essay in the form of a proclamation to the Jewish nation from the commander-in-chief of the armies of the French Republic in Africa and Asia to the legitimate heirs of Palestine. Among the text was included, "Make haste. A moment like this will not return for 1,000 years to allow you to reclaim your civil rights, your place among the peoples of the world. Your nation has a right to a political existence among the other nations. You have the right to worship God freely according to your religion." Napoleon's imminent failure at Acre killed this grand idea at birth. But in France, within less than a year, Napoleon would become the first head of state to implement full integration of the Jews, despite strong opposition.